Welcome, everyone. We're embarking on an intensive examination of one of the most chilling acts of bioterrorism in U.S. history, the 2001 Anthrax attacks, an event the FBI officially codenamed Amerithrax.
And you have to remember the context. This all unfolded in the immediate shadow of September 11th. The country was already reeling, and this just compounded that profound sense of vulnerability.
It really did. It was just one crisis on top of another.
Exactly. And what's so grimly significant here is that these attacks marked the only lethal use of anthrax outside of, actual warfare. This biological assault launched an investigation that the FBI itself admitted was one of the largest and most complex in the history of law enforcement.
It's an incredible story. It's a narrative that's just built on layers of forensic science, a lot of intense political maneuvering, and, well, scientific findings that are still deeply contested.
To this day.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward, but it's challenging. For you, the listener, we're going to dissect the source materials that detail these attacks. We'll trace the long investigation, scrutinize the science, and really highlight the lingering questions that prevent a complete closure of this case, even with the government's formal conclusion.
But before we get into all of that, it's so important that we pause.
Yes.
We need to remember the 5 innocent people who lost their lives.
Bob Stevens, Thomas Morris Jr., Joseph Christine, Kathleen Gawain, and Ottilie Lundgren.
And the 17 others who were infected. We're talking at least 22 reported infections in total. And many of those people suffered from serious, lingering health problems for years.
The human cost is it's immense.
And the scale of the investigation, it really reflects that. It was a national emergency. When you just look at the raw statistics, the resources they deployed, it's just astonishing.
I mean, 6 continents.
6 continents. They traveled everywhere looking for leads. They interviewed over 9,000 people and issued more than 6,000 subpoenas.
All for what they thought was a single person, or maybe a small group.
Right. And the contamination just spread so far beyond the initial targets. It ended up affecting dozens of sites, from Florida all the way up to Washington, D.C.
And the cost, upwards of $1 billion just for decontamination.
$1 billion. It's staggering.
It is. Okay, so that sets the scene. Let's unpack this investigation by starting right at the beginning with the timeline of the attacks and the physical evidence. Those terrifying letters. So the attack timeline, it starts fast, right in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. But what's so critical for you to understand is that the mailings, they were segmented. There were 2 distinct waves.
And they differed not just in who they were targeting, but crucially in the potency of the material itself. The composition was completely different.
So tell us about that first wave.
The first wave came very, very early. The envelopes had a Trenton, New Jersey postmark. The date was September 18th, 2001.
Just a week after 9/11.
Exactly, 1 week. And the targets were exclusively news media offices.
Media.
All media. We believe 5 letters were sent. You had ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, and the New York Post. All of them right there in Manhattan.
And the 5th one?
The 5th went to the National Enquirer, which is published by American Media, Inc., or AMI, down in Boca Raton, Florida.
And the first confirmed fatality, that came directly from that media wave.
It did. Robert Stevens, he was a photo editor at AMI. He died on October 5th.
And what's so chilling about his exposure is that the letter that they think infected him, they never even found it.
Never recovered it. Authorities only found the letters that were sent to NBC and the New York Post.
Yeah.
The others just disappeared.
And the material in that first wave, it was characterized as being pretty crude, wasn't it?
Very crude. The anthrax, specifically the material they recovered from the New York Post letter, was described in reports as a coarse, brown, granular material.
I think I read some investigators compared it to dry dog food.
That's the morbid comparison, yes.
Right.
The preparation was clearly not highly refined. It was clumpy.
So what was the immediate public health result of this cruder material?
Well, the relatively coarse nature of it seems to have directly resulted in more cutaneous anthrax cases.
The skin infection.
The skin infection, which is less lethal. So 9 of the 12 known cases in that first group were cutaneous.
But it was still deadly.
Oh, absolutely. Despite being less refined, this wave still caused life-threatening inhalational anthrax. It caused Stevens' death, and later, the death of Kathleen Gawain, who worked at a mail facility in New York.
And they never pinpointed her exact source of exposure, did they?
Never definitively identified, no. But she was in the geographical area affected by those media mailings. So the material, even though it seemed crude, it was absolutely deadly.
Then we see this dramatic shift to the second wave.
A huge shift.
This one is dated October 9th, 2001. Again, Trenton postmark, so about 3 weeks after the first attack. And the targets had shifted completely.
That's right. It went from media to the highest levels of political leadership. This second wave targeted two very visible U.S. senators, Tom Daschle, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time,
And Patrick Leahy.
and Patrick Leahy, who headed the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee, both prominent Democrats.
And the timing is so important here. This stuff is circulating through the postal system while the entire country is just consumed by the political fallout of 9/11 and the impending war on terror.
It's all happening at once.
And the difference in the biological weapon itself was it was stark. This was not the coarse, brown, granular stuff from the first wave.
Absolutely not. The Senate letters contained a far, far more potent substance. It was a highly refined, nearly pure dry powder, about 1 gram of material in each envelope.
And this powder was so fine, so aerosolizable, that when the Daschle letter was opened on October 15th in the Hart Senate office building, I mean, it was immediate panic.
Total panic. They shut down the government mail service across D.C. immediately.
And the Leahy letter, that was discovered later, wasn't it?
It was. It was found in an impounded mail bag at the now infamous Brentwood postal facility. It had been misdirected.
And that high degree of refinement, the particle size, that explains the lethality of this second batch, doesn't it?
Precisely. That refined powder produced the most dangerous form of infection, inhalational anthrax. 8 of the 10 resulting cases were inhalational.
And the symptoms, they're often mistaken for just the common flu at first.
Right. But it progresses with terrifying speed to hemorrhagic shock and respiratory failure. The refinement of the powder enabled those spores to get deep into the human lung, bypassing all our natural defenses.
So this difference between the two waves, the dog food powder and this pure weaponized powder, this becomes the first major point of scientific contention.
It really does. It suggests either two completely different perpetrators or one perpetrator whose technical skill just radically increased in the span of 3 weeks.
Which seems unlikely.
Very unlikely.
So regarding the physical origin of the mailings, where did the investigators ultimately zero in?
They focused on a single street mailbox. It was at 10 Nassau Street, right near Princeton University in New Jersey.
And how did they narrow it down to just that one?
Well, investigators screened over 600 mailboxes in the region. 600. And this was the only one that tested positive for anthrax spores.
Wow. So it strongly suggests the perpetrator lived or worked somewhere within, easy driving distance of Princeton.
That was the assumption. And another important point, the letters themselves weren't originals.
They were copies.
All copies made on machine.
Yeah.
And that meant the source envelope, the address label, anything that might have yielded forensic clues like saliva or latent fingerprints. They never found it.
Okay, let's talk about the notes themselves. They used this really bizarre, fictitious return address.
4th grade, Greendale School, Franklin Park, NJ 0852.
And we know Franklin Park is a real place, but the ZIP code is actually for nearby Monmouth Junction.
Right, and there is no Greendale School. It's completely made up.
The text, though, that carries this disturbing, very consistent rhetoric that seems like an attempt to place the attack in a very specific post-9/11 context.
The text was clearly intended to underscore the immediate hysteria. It was framing the attacks as religiously or politically motivated, using that extremist language that was so prevalent at the time.
And you can see an evolution in the language.
You can. The media letters contained 09/11/01. This is next. Take penicillin sick now. Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great. All caps, no punctuation.
And what do we make of that bizarre piece of medical advice? Take penicillin sick now.
It's highly contradictory, and it's fueled just endless speculation. I mean, why would a terrorist who's intent on mass murder suggest a specific treatment?
Right.
Some sources suggest this was a kind of self-sabotage, maybe, or perhaps a non-denial denial. The mailer knew the media workers would be handling the envelope, so maybe they were trying to limit the harm to just the immediate targets.
It shows a knowledge of the treatment, though, which kind of points away from the typical al-Qaeda narrative they were pushing.
It does. Then you get to the Senate letters, and you see a definite escalation in both the tone and the preparation.
How so?
Well, the handwriting was roughly half the size. It was punctuated more carefully, and the tone was just far more direct, more threatening. 09/11/01, you cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great.
The suggestion of medical help is just gone.
Gone. Replaced by a direct personal threat. You die now.
So this progression suggests that the perpetrator, if it was the same person, had either shed any pretense of restraint.
Or had gained a huge amount of confidence and was now testing a much, much deadlier product.
So it's a critical synthesis point. The first batch was coarse, less potent, caused more skin infections, and included a strange warning.
And the second batch was a fine, pure powder, highly potent, caused lethal inhalational cases, and issued a direct, unvarnished threat.
This difference. This becomes the absolute crux of the entire scientific investigation. So the scientific path of this investigation, it began with a huge initial step, identifying the genetic identity of the bacteria.
Right, and all the material from both waves
Yeah.
was derived from the same bacterial strain.
The Ames strain.
The Ames strain. And we have to clarify the origin story of the Ames strain because the name is a bit of a misnomer.
It sounds like it came from Ames, Iowa.
It does, but that's a geographical error that just became a permanent scientific label. It was actually first isolated from a sick cow down in Texas back in 1981.
So how did it get the name?
Just an administrative mix-up. A mailing label got confused at the time, and the name stuck.
And crucially, this strain wasn't rare. It wasn't uniquely held by some secret state program.
Not at all. It was widely distributed for research purposes. We're talking at least 16 bioresearch labs inside the U.S., and 3 international locations, Canada, Sweden, and the UK.
So it was just a standard research material.
A standard material in biodefense and agricultural science. And that distribution, that poses the first massive challenge for the FBI.
Right. How do you trace a common strain of bacteria that's used across 16, maybe more labs, back to a single person?
That's where microbial forensics became revolutionary, really out of necessity. They started by sequencing the DNA of the attack Anthrax, starting with a sample from Robert Stevens, and that confirmed it was the Ames strain.
Okay.
Then further forensic work, including radiocarbon dating, established that the anthrax was cultured pretty recently, no more than 2 years before the mailings.
So that ruled out, what, old Cold War stockpiles or something?
Exactly. It meant it was fresh material from a contemporary lab.
But the truly novel, the real game-changing work involved finding the genetic equivalent of a unique fingerprint within this common strain.
Precise.
Oh.
By 2004, bioinformatics scientists, they identified these minute variants or mutations in the anthrax cultures. Specifically, they found 3 relatively large changes regions of the DNA that had been duplicated or triplicated.
And these changes acted like unique genetic markers.
They did. They essentially built a signature for that specific batch of the Ames strain. These mutations became the foundation for the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, assays. Those are the genetic tools they use to test thousands of other Ames samples from all over the world.
So if the Ames strain is the general car model, these 3 mutations were like the custom pin striping and the unique VIN number.
That is a perfect analogy. This was the microbiological equivalent of building a genetic key that would only fit one specific lock, the material grown from the original parent source of the attack spores.
And that allowed investigators to test samples in this massive database, just searching for a match to these specific genetic fingerprints.
Yes. And this method, this is what would eventually lead them to the Fort Detrick facility.
But before that genetic key could unlock the suspect, the investigation took a wild turn into one of the most significant and, frankly, confusing controversies of the whole case: the physical sophistication of the material, which was widely referred to as weaponization.
It was. In late October 2001, just as the Senate attacks were unfolding, a top scientist at USAMRIID, the Army's Infectious Disease Institute, a man named Peter Jarling, he reported some shocking signs.
And USAMRIID is at Fort Detrick.
The very same place, yes. Jarling reported signs that silicon had been added to the Dashel anthrax.
Silicon, and why was that so alarming?
Because silicon additives, when they're prepared properly, can help prevent spores from clumping together. They keep them extremely fine and light. Theoretically, that makes them much more capable of penetrating deep into the lungs.
So weaponized.
That's the term.
Huh.
The immediate concern was that this meant foreign state sponsorship because of the technical sophistication required to manipulate the spores that way.
And the accounts from inside the lab were horrifying. They really spoke to the unique nature of this substance.
They did. When scientists examined the spores under a transmission electron microscope, after they deactivated them with harsh chemicals, the spores began to ooze. Jarling described seeing fried egg gunk dripping off the spores. So the technical question immediately became, was this high-level processing the kind of thing you'd need for a major bioweapons program, maybe from a place like Iraq?
And this technical description, This is what led directly to the single most damaging false lead of the entire investigation.
The bentonite claim.
The bentonite claim, which immediately intersected the science with some very high-stakes politics.
It did. On October 26, 2001, Brian Ross of ABC News went on air and reported, citing multiple sources, that the anthrax in the Daschle letter was laced with bentonite.
And bentonite was an additive known to be used by only one country in producing bioweapons.
Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
So that claim, which spread like wildfire, it strongly implicated Saddam Hussein. It fueled the narrative that these attacks were foreign-sponsored.
A biological extension of 9/11?
And it became part of the case for war. The damage was immense.
It was.
But how quickly did authorities actually manage to walk back that massive error? Or was the damage just already done?
It was refuted almost instantly, but you're right, the damage was certainly done. A White House spokesman, Scott Stanzel, he explicitly denied that bentonite had been found. Major General John Parker confirmed that while they had found silica, which is silicon dioxide bentonite, is a specific combination of silicate plus aluminum.
And there was no aluminum.
He stated flatly that tests had confirmed there was no aluminum in the sample.
But the reporter insisted he had 4 well-placed and separate sources.
He did. Yet despite that, no tests ever confirmed the bentonite claim. That single, incorrect piece of reporting contributed significantly to the pre-war hysteria and the public's belief that this material required a massive state apparatus to create.
But the core dispute over the silicon content itself, even without the aluminum and the bentonite, that remained critical.
It did. The FBI lab concluded that 1.4% of the powder in the Lee letter was silicon.
And what made that specific figure so important to the weaponization argument?
Well, a leading expert in small particle chemistry, a man named Stuart Jacobson, he declared that 1.4% to be a shockingly high proportion. In his view, that level was entirely consistent with deliberate, controlled weaponization, meaning it was engineered for maximum dispersibility.
And not consistent with accidental contamination from a lab.
Exactly, not at all.
So to test this, the government brought in some of the most advanced scientists in the country.
They did. Scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory performed 56 different experiments trying to replicate this finding. They tried adjusting the growth medium, adding more and more silicon, just trying to see if the growth conditions alone could account for that 1.4% level.
And what was the outcome?
All 56 failed. They produced results that were far, far below the level found in the attack anthrax.
So Livermore's conclusion was devastating to the natural contamination theory.
It was. They determined that something other than the normal growth media had to be controlling the absorption of that silicon.
Which strongly implied an external, non-natural factor. It bolstered the weaponized argument.
It absolutely did.
But this is where the narrative tension just ratchets up, because the FBI ultimately adopted a dramatically different stance on how sophisticated this anthrax was.
It did. I mean, the FBI was under immense pressure to find a domestic culprit and close the case without having to acknowledge some sophisticated, unknown foreign entity. Their official conclusion required them to pivot.
So how did they do that?
An FBI scientist, Douglas Beecher, he later published an article specifically criticizing what he called the widely circulated misconception of sophisticated engineering. He argued that the powders were comprised simply of spores purified to different extents. He basically asserted that the whole focus on weaponization was a distraction.
So we have this profound conflict. Is the silica a sign of sophisticated, deliberate processing, or is it just a simple function of natural biology?
That's the central ambiguity the government had to resolve to be able to charge a domestic suspect like Ivins, who allegedly lacked the ability for that kind of industrial-scale weaponization.
It seems like they found a way.
Well, some internal scientific findings showed that silicon was present naturally inside the spore coats of some spores, up to 65–75% of them. In one specific instance, they even found silicon inside a spore that was still within the mother germ, meaning it had to be incorporated naturally during growth.
And the FBI leveraged that finding.
They did. They used it to assert the element was naturally occurring, not externally added after purification.
So if we use an analogy, was the silica baked into the cake as part of the spore's natural biology, or was it sprinkled on top, which would be deliberate weaponization?
The FBI chose the baked-into-the-cake theory, the natural variability conclusion.
But that conclusion, it directly contradicted the initial statements by their own experts. It contradicted the failed Livermore experiments.
It contradicted the opinions of many independent bioweapon specialists, yes. Richard Spurzel, who led the UN biological weapons inspections in Iraq, he remained highly skeptical of the FBI's pivot. In his view, those high silica levels suggested a need for specialized scientific know-how that Bruce Ivins, the later suspect, allegedly lacked.
And Ivan's own supervisor backed that up.
He did. Jeffrey Adamovich publicly stated that Ivins did not have the skills or the means to produce or attach silicon compounds to spores. The Fort Detrick facility just wasn't set up for large-scale production or for handling anthrax in powdered form.
So the FBI ultimately had to attribute the high silica levels to natural variability, a conclusion that necessitated ignoring a lot of evidence about the extreme technical difficulty.
That scientific tug-of-war is central to why the closure of this case remains so controversial.
The Amerithrax investigation, as massive as it was, it faced these huge institutional and political hurdles right from day one. And one of the most stunning failures in those early days was the rapid loss of critical comparative evidence.
The destruction of the Iowa State University Anthrax archive. It was a profound, you could argue a tragic, loss for the investigation.
And this was in October 2001, right as the attacks were peaking.
Yes. The FBI and the CDC authorized Iowa State to destroy this enormous collection. We're talking over 100 vials of anthrax spores that had been collected over 7 decades.
Why was that destruction so crucial? What did they lose?
Well, scientists argued at the time that a precise genetic match between the attack strain and a specific strain held in that historical archive. It could have offered crucial chronological and geographical clues.
It could have shown when and how widely the bacteria had been distributed before the attack.
Exactly. Imagine being able to trace that material back to a specific year and location 30 years ago.
Yep.
That chain of custody could have narrowed the suspect pool drastically.
And that evidence, that entire historical microbiological database, was just eliminated.
Gone.
And that investigative gap was then compounded by this intense political pressure to quickly identify a perpetrator.
Preferably one with a foreign connection, to fit the national security narrative of the moment.
Right.
The pressure on the FBI and its director, Robert Mueller, was immense. We know from reports that immediately following 9/11, White House officials were pressuring Mueller to publicly blame al-Qaeda. According to former aides, Mueller was repeatedly criticized during intelligence briefings for not producing proof that linked the spores to Osama bin Laden.
And this was happening even though the FBI knew early on that the anthrax sophistication, even the crude first batch, required equipment that was, what was the quote, unlikely to have been produced in some cave.
Right. They knew it required a lab.
So the narrative of foreign involvement, fueled by that incorrect bentonite report, was being actively encouraged from the very highest levels of government.
It was. Publicly, you had President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Senator John McCain, all of them speculating about a link between the attacks and al-Qaeda or Iraq.
Which created a kind of political feedback loop.
It did. The media reported the speculation reinforced the bentonite lie, and the cumulative effect was to contribute directly to that intense atmosphere of war hysteria that was so prevalent in 2002 and 2003.
It's a classic example of speculation just outpacing the facts with profound consequences.
For foreign policy and for public trust.
The investigation did eventually shift focus domestically, and it landed on a specific bioweapons expert as the initial target, Stephen Hatfill. How did he become the focus of this massive manhunt?
The domestic focus was largely initiated by Dr. Barbara Hatch Rosenberg. She was a molecular biologist and a bioweapons expert. She publicly theorized that the attacker was a rogue scientist from U.S. Amride who fit a specific profile.
What was the profile?
Proper skills, extensive experience with anthrax, mandatory vaccination status, and forensic training.
And she then publicly named a most likely person.
She did. And this was immediately amplified by Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, who published these columns essentially hinting at the killer's profile, leading the public directly to Hatfill without actually naming him.
And the FBI then publicly focused on Hatfill, searching his apartment in June 2002.
A very public search.
And then Attorney General John Ashcroft cemented his association by labeling him a person of interest during a highly publicized news conference.
I mean, can you imagine being publicly marked as the potential perpetrator of the greatest bioterror attack in U.S. history?
It must have been terrifying, professionally and personally catastrophic for him.
It was. Hatfill, who was a virologist, was later completely exonerated. The government was never able to build a case.
And he successfully sued them.
He did. He sued the government for violating his constitutional rights with that public and damaging search. He settled out of court for $5.8 million.
And he also settled defamation lawsuits against several media outlets.
He did, and the government settlement, which was made without any admission of liability, it clearly indicated how weak their initial public case against him was. It just showed how quickly the FBI had rushed to judgment to satisfy that political pressure for a domestic arrest.
So the focus of the Amerithrax investigation shifts dramatically away from Stephen Hatfill and toward a new target around, what, April 2005?
That's right, April 2005. The new target was Dr. Bruce Ivins.
And he was a biodefense researcher who had worked for 18 years at the very same facility, USM, at Fort Detrick, Maryland.
Right, and this marked the final and highly controversial chapter for the FBI.
It concluded abruptly and tragically.
It did. Dr. Ivins died by suicide on July 29, 2008, an overdose of acetaminophen, as federal prosecutors were finalizing their case and preparing to file criminal charges against him.
Just a week after his death, prosecutors publicly declared him the sole perpetrator, August 6, 2008. And the entire conclusion of the Amerithrax case, it hinged on one crucial scientific piece of evidence: the genetic sequencing of the anthrax.
It did. It all hinged on the highly advanced microbial forensics we talked about earlier.
The genetic key.
The genetic key. The attack anthrax was confirmed as the Ames strain, but that detailed analysis identified the unique genetic variants, those 3 duplicated or triplicated DNA regions. And investigators found that this unique genetic fingerprint matched the parent material found in a specific flask,
Known as RMR DRAS ODU29.
a flask that was maintained and solely controlled by Bruce Ivins in his lab at Fort Detrick.
So the FBI's conclusion was that this RMR 1029 flask, this was the progenitor material. This was the murder weapon used to grow the attack spores.
That's what they said.
That sounds incredibly compelling, but how absolute was that link?
Well, it was genetically strong, but it was forensically weak in other areas. The FBI asserted that the unique combination of those 3 mutations, they called them morphs, identified the specific batch grown in RMR 1029 as the direct ancestor of the attack material.
But this is where the access issue comes back.
It absolutely does. While Ivins controlled the flask, the FBI later had to concede that they had identified 419 people at Fort Detrick and other locations who had access to the lab where RMR 1029 was stored.
Or had received samples grown from it.
Or had received samples. So the genetic link proved the lab was the source, but not necessarily the individual.
But the FBI also built a strong case based on Ivins' behavioral pattern, his actions, which they interpreted as consciousness of guilt and obstruction.
They did. They pointed to specific suspicious actions that he took around the time the FBI was focusing on Fort Detrick.
Such as?
This included Ivins taking unauthorized environmental samples in his own lab and later decontaminating areas without reporting these actions through the official channels.
So the argument was he was trying to wipe out any trace evidence?
Trying to wipe out any link between the spores and his workspace, yes.
And this is where the narrative gets truly dramatic, tying his scientific profession directly to the alleged act of terror. He reportedly threw away a copy of the book Gödel, Escher, Bach in an article.
An article from the American Scientist Journal about codons and hidden messages.
Right after the FBI had searched his office. Why would disposing of books be considered evidence?
Because the FBI was looking for an intellectual link, a signature. And this led them to their analysis of an alleged hidden code in the media letters.
The letters to the media, the first wave.
The first wave. The FBI's theory suggested that certain seemingly random, highlighted or emboldened characters in the text, specifically the letters A and T, contained a hidden message.
And when investigators lifted out just those bolded letters, what was the sequence they got?
They derived the sequence TTT-AATAT.
And what's the significance of that?
Those 3-letter sequences are codons. They're the fundamental units of genetic code that specify amino acids.
Okay.
TTT codes for phenylalanine, which is F-A-E-T, codes for asparagine, which is N, and TT codes for tyrosine, Y.
So the resulting 3-letter sequence is FNY.
FNY.
That is a staggering finding, if it was intentional. Did the FBI settle on a meaning for FNY?
They suggested 2 possible hidden messages, though they acknowledged they were impossible to determine with certainty. One was that FNY was a verbal assault on New York, standing for FEC New York.
And they had evidence Ivins disliked New York City.
They did. He was known to have a strong personal dislike for the city and its inhabitants, which is where 4 of the 5 media letters were sent.
And the second possibility?
The second was Pat, the nickname of a former female colleague whom Ivins reportedly disliked intensely and obsessed over.
So regardless of the exact translation, the FBI emphasized that the key point was the very existence of a hidden message that was constructed using biochemical codons.
Right. It pointed to a perpetrator who was a genetic scientist familiar with this precise language, a description that perfectly fit Bruce Ivins.
And on top of all that, the case was supported by this horrifying psychological profile.
Detailing his severe and documented mental instability and a history of threats, which painted a picture of an individual capable of extreme violence.
And let's look at the timeline of that instability. This wasn't a sudden break, right? These warning signs existed years before the attacks.
They did. A mental health counselor who treated Ivins in mid-2000s, so more than a year before the Anthrax attacks, reported an incident that was chillingly prophetic. Ivins reportedly gave an emotionless description of a specific homicidal plan.
A plan to do what?
To poison a young woman if her soccer team lost a championship game. He emphasized to the counselor that he was a skillful scientist who knew how to do things without people finding out.
And the counselor reported this.
She was so alarmed she alerted the police, but they reportedly told her nothing could be done without the woman's contact information.
That is a massive institutional failure in retrospect.
It is, and the mental instability, it just accelerated years later as the FBI started closing in.
By 2008, his behavior was severely erratic.
It was. A different therapist sought a restraining order, stating Ivins planned to kill his coworkers and go out in a blaze of glory.
Wow.
The therapist testified he had a bulletproof vest, and he maintained a detailed list of people who had wronged him at work.
And his own psychiatrist.
His own psychiatrist, Dr. David Irwin, called him homicidal, sociopathic, with clear intentions.
So the FBI argued that the attacks themselves were a direct manifestation of this deep-seated rage.
Against colleagues in the world, yes.
And while he was in a psychiatric hospital in June 2008, just before his suicide, Ivins made statements the FBI leader used to solidify their conclusion.
Statements they categorized as non-denial denials.
What does that mean?
Well, they focused on his reported memory loss. When he was asked about the Anthrax attacks, he admitted to memory lapses. He said he would sometimes wake up fully dressed and wonder if he'd gone out during the night.
He said things like, "I do not have any recollection of ever having done anything like that."
Right. But crucially, he also said he still felt responsibility because the RMR 1029 flask wasn't locked up at the time.
So the FBI took this highly suggestive behavior and this implicit admission about the source flask as circumstantial evidence that the killer was, in fact, Bruce Ivins. So the case against Bruce Ivins, while it's built on this compelling genetic link and a very disturbing psychological profile, it immediately generated intense scrutiny.
And skepticism. From the scientific community, from his colleagues, even from the targeted politicians.
The core issue seems to be that the evidence, once you move past that RMR 1029 flask, it was heavily circumstantial.
That is the essential tension of the case closure. The genetic link was incredibly useful for pinpointing the lab, but the FBI had to rely almost entirely on motive and opportunity to pinpoint the man.
And as we established, Ivins was only one of at least 419 people who had access to the parent material or samples from it.
Right. The FBI had to build this tight narrative connecting Ivins to the actual process of growing the spores, purifying them into that fine powder, putting them in the envelopes, and mailing them from New Jersey.
And the physical evidence just didn't support that connection, according to some key sources.
It didn't. The FBI's own genetic consultant, a woman named Claire Fraser Liggett, she pointed out a massive evidentiary hole.
Which was?
The failure to find any spores, not even microscopic residual contamination, in Ivins' house, in his car, or on any of his personal belongings.
For a person who supposedly weaponized a gram of highly purified anthrax spores and carried that lethal material to a New Jersey mailbox.
The lack of any trace evidence was viewed as a very serious undermining factor for the physical case against him.
And one of the high-profile targets, Senator Patrick Leahy, whose office was contaminated, he expressed his doubt publicly.
He did. Senator Leahy stated very clearly that he did not believe Ivins acted alone. He suggested there were others involved, either as accessories before or accessories after the fact.
He also pointed out the randomness of the targets seems strange for a solo, disturbed researcher.
Right. Media outlets combined with two specific politically powerful Democratic senators. It was an odd mix.
But the most profound doubts, they came from Ivins' colleagues, the people who knew his skill set and the lab environment intimately.
And they challenged the fundamental feasibility of him producing that weaponized material in secret.
The first major hurdle was the highly refined, powdered nature of the second wave.
Yes. Jeffrey Admovitz, who was Ivins' supervisor, he stated flatly that Ivins did not possess the specific technical skills or the means to attach silicon compounds to spores. Furthermore, the Fort Detrick facility was designed to handle anthrax in liquid form for vaccine research, not in powdered form for dissemination.
And this technical challenge was dramatically amplified by another colleague, Henry Hine, a microbiologist at the lab.
He testified to the subsequent National Academy of Sciences panel, and he challenged the sheer scale of the operation required.
What was his calculation?
Heine calculated that producing the quantity of spores found in those letters, we're talking upwards of 871 billion spores in the Leahy letter alone.
That's an astronomical number.
It is. He said it would have required at least a year of intensive, nonstop work using the lab's available equipment.
And such an extensive, continuous effort, he argued. It just could not have gone unnoticed.
Not by colleagues, not by security personnel. Impossible.
And Hine raised a truly critical containment issue that really undercuts the lab as the manufacturing site. If that massive quantity of aerosolizable powder was being dried and processed, shouldn't we have seen massive secondary contamination?
Absolutely. Patricia Worsham, who was chief of the bacteriology division at the Army lab, she later conceded that the specific equipment needed for drying the spores into that fine powder things like a spray dryer or a lyophilizer.
That equipment was not located in a biological containment area.
Not in a biocontainment hood, no.
Mm.
So if Ivins had produced the required quantity there, releasing aerosolized spores into the air, it should have led to mass casualties.
Dead lab animal.
Dead lab animals or dead people in nearby labs and offices, none of which occurred.
And that profound lack of collateral contamination makes the Fort Detrick lab highly unlikely as the site of large-scale production.
Makes it very, very difficult to believe.
So these professional doubts, they provided the impetus for official, independent scientific reviews of the FBI's methods and conclusions. And the results of these reviews, they were highly critical.
They were damning. The 2011 report from the National Academy of Sciences, the NANAGASE, which the FBI itself had commissioned because of all the skepticism, it concluded that it was impossible to reach any definitive conclusion about the origins of the anthrax in the letters, based solely on the available scientific evidence.
Wait, impossible to reach any definitive conclusion? That directly undercuts the FBI's formal closure of the case, which was built solely on that scientific evidence.
It does. The NANAS report explicitly challenged the FBI's assertion that RMR-129 was the definitive parent material for the attack spores.
So what did they argue?
They argued that while the attack material was clearly derived from the Ames strain and shared those unique mutations, the science could not rule out that other samples of the Ames strain existed with those same mutations.
Or that RMR-1029 had been derived from some common source flask that was shared by many people.
Exactly. The genetic analysis, while powerful, it only identified the source batch, not the source individual.
And a separate review by the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, that also found significant flaws.
Yeah, it did. The GAO study cited shortcomings in the FBI's testing methods, a serious lack of rigorous scientific controls. They noted that the FBI failed to fully understand the conditions that enabled the genetic mutations they were relying on. And they pointed out a critical lack of uncertainty measures for their statistical interpretation.
So, in plain language, the forensic evidence was strong, but the interpretation of what that evidence proved about the individual suspect was statistically unreliable.
That's a good way to put it.
And even after the case was closed, new technical studies kept raising questions about the sophistication that the FBI had chosen to disregard.
In 2011, a study found high levels of tin detected in the mailed anthrax. Tin. The authors argued that this preparation required a high level of chemical sophistication, suggesting the tin might have been used to encapsulate the spores for better dispersal, similar to the silicon. And crucially, the FBI's final 92-page summary report failed entirely to mention or address the tin content.
Which seems like a major omission.
A huge red flag about the integrity of their final conclusion.
Politically, the skepticism remained high enough that Congressman Rush Holt, whose New Jersey district included the exact mailbox used for the mailings, he repeatedly proposed legislation for an independent commission.
To review the case from the ground up, yes. Holt argued that allowing the FBI to self-review its flawed investigation would undermine public confidence.
But the Obama administration opposed this.
They did. They were facing the prospect of relitigating a decade-old terror case, and they called it duplicative of the FBI's work.
So despite the official closure and the suicide of the named suspect, you have key members of Congress, Ivins' own colleagues, and independent scientific bodies all expressing these serious reservations.
That tension between the definitive genetic link and the massive circumstantial gaps, that remains the defining feature of Amerithrax.
And even with the case formally closed, the practical, the policy, the health impacts of Amerithrax were staggering and long-lasting. This wasn't just a criminal case, it was a national infrastructural crisis.
Oh, absolutely. The contamination alone required one of the most extensive and expensive bio-cleanups in U.S. history.
The list of contaminated sites is it's massive. It stretches from media headquarters to government centers.
Dozens of buildings. The Hart Senate Office Building, the Ford Office Building, numerous media offices in New York City. The cleanup required specialized companies using intensive HEPA-filtered air scrubbers, highly regulated HEPA vacuums, massive amounts of decontamination foam.
And the sheer cost is unbelievable. The decontamination of the Brentwood Postal Facility in Washington, D.C.
Where two postal workers died, Thomas Morris Jr. and Joseph Cursine.
That took 26 months and cost $130 million.
And the Hamilton, New Jersey facility, where the material was processed, required another $65 million for cleanup.
So when you add up all the sites, the total expense for the contamination and cleanup exceeded $1 billion.
Over $1 billion. This single attack fundamentally changed how the country approaches mail security and biological preparedness.
And on the policy side, the political fallout from the anthrax attacks coming directly after 9/11, it just intensified pressure for anti-terrorism legislation.
Absolutely. The attacks contributed significantly to the rapid passage of the Patriot Act, cementing surveillance and security measures that are still controversial today.
And we have to remember that early, incorrect narrative linking the anthrax to Iraq.
It fueled the pre-war environment. It influenced public opinion leading directly up to the 2003 invasion. That media-driven lie had tangible foreign policy consequences.
The fear also spurred massive government investment in biological defense research.
Government funding for biological warfare research and preparedness just surged. It transformed the entire biodefense landscape.
The most significant piece of legislation was the Project BioShield Act of 2004.
Which provided $5.6 billion over 10 years, specifically for stockpiling new vaccines and drugs to combat biothreats. This included things like the monoclonal antibody raxibacumab and the anthrax vaccine Absorbed. The government recognized it was just grossly unprepared.
And the attacks forced immediate medical responses under crisis conditions. We know that even before the Daschle letter was opened, the White House was already distributing ciprofloxacin to senior staffers.
The only FDA-approved drug for inhalational anthrax treatment at the time. It shows the internal fear was already present.
It also led to a massive public debate over the cost and distribution of antibiotics.
It did. The sheer potential scale of the threat meant the U.S. government seriously considered overriding Bayer's patent on ciprofloxacin just to secure cheaper generic versions for the national stockpile.
A direct confrontation between pharmaceutical profits and public health security. And on a cultural level, the impact was profound and lasting. The attacks led to the widespread curtailment of physical U.S. mail. Checks, bills, packages. They just stopped arriving at media companies and government offices.
And for many people and businesses, that trauma just accelerated the cultural shift away from physical mail and toward email. It forced a technological leap out of fear.
And finally, we can't overlook the devastating long-term human cost.
No. Survivors reported lingering health problems for years. Chronic fatigue, shortness of breath, memory loss.
The government was later forced to settle a major lawsuit filed by the widow of the first victim, Robert Ivins, for $2.5 million.
And they did so without admitting liability. They stated the settlement was solely for the purpose of avoiding the expenses and risks of further litigations.
And that necessary legal formality paying out without admitting fault, it just underscores the continued legal and evidentiary ambiguity that plagues the official narrative.
So we have thoroughly examined the full, contested arc of the Amerithrax investigation. We've reviewed the forensic and psychological evidence that led the government to declare the case closed. And at the same time, we've reviewed the significant scientific and legal skepticism that followed.
And this tension, it highlights the fundamental conflict between forensic certainty, that genetic link of the parent material to flask RMR 1029, and the numerous, highly detailed circumstantial gaps regarding the perpetrator's technical capability and, the physical act of mailing.
Right. While the Department of Justice maintains Bruce Ivins was the sole culprit, based primarily on that genetic link, you have all these contradictory findings about the weaponization. The fact that the high silicon levels could not be replicated by national labs.
Along with his alleged lack of technical means to produce such a refined powder and the inability to definitively place him at the New Jersey mailbox. These remain key points of contention that continue to define the public narrative.
The Amerithrax story is a powerful reminder that even in cases involving high-tech bioforensics, the narrative has to ultimately satisfy the broader scientific and logistical requirements of the crime.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider.
Even a successful identification of the strain of a biological weapon may not be sufficient to close a case if the ability to acquire or produce that weapon cannot be tied definitively to the perpetrator. In a world with distributed scientific knowledge, where highly specialized materials are available to hundreds of people, where does the security boundary truly lie?
Thank you for sharing this time with us. Thanks for listening.